Good evening. On behalf of Artha Global, I would like to welcome all of you to what promises to be a much needed and insightful conversation on the drug regulation system in India. We are glad to host this discussion as part of our Artha Conversation series, which are curated roundtables designed to foster free and frank discussions and innovative thinking around policy challenges. Let me take a minute to introduce our speakers for this evening, Dinesh Thakur and Prashant Reddy, authors of the recently released book, The Truth Pill, The Myth of Drug Regulation in India. Dinesh Thakur is a public health activist focused on improving the quality of affordable medicines around the world. He was recognized with the Joe A. Calloway Award for Civic Courage in 2014 and is the recipient of the ACFE's Cliff Robertson Sentinel Award. He turned whistleblower against Ranbaxy Laboratories after witnessing large-scale data fraud at the company, leading the company to plead guilty before an American court in 2013. Since 2014, he has advocated for reform of India's colonial-era Drugs and Cosmetic Act of 1940 and has founded an advocacy group called the Citizens for Affordable, Safe, and Effective Medicine, also known as CASM. He is also the founder and president of the Thakur Family Foundation, a philanthropic organization that provides grants for research on public health and health journalism in India. Prashant Reddy is a lawyer by profession. He studied at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, and Stanford Law School in California as a J.N. Tata scholar. After a stint in litigation teams at two Delhi-based law firms specializing in intellectual property law, he worked in academia and think tanks in New Delhi, Hyderabad, and Singapore. Over the last few years, he has been advising Dinesh Thakur in his advocacy campaign for the reform of drug regulatory law in India. Prashant is also the co-author of Create, Copy, Disrupt, India's Intellectual Property Dilemmas. So welcome, Dinesh and Prashant. We will start the session with a 30-minute discussion with the guest speakers and then open the floor for a round of Q&A with the audience. Please use the Q&A box for any questions you might have, and we will do our best to answer all of your questions. I will begin this evening with a mention of three recent events that should make us all realize that we do have a problem that needs to be addressed. First, at the end of the year 2019, there was a cluster of 21 children, most of them from Ramnagar in Jammu, with respiratory symptoms who then developed vomiting and were found to have kidney failure. A lot of these children were admitted at PGI Chandigarh. 11 of these children between the age of 2 months and 6 years, unfortunately, eventually succumbed. It was found that all of these children had consumed a cough syrup called Cold Best, manufactured by a company called Digital Vision with a base in Himachal Pradesh. The company, prior to this, had been cited at least 13 times in the XLN database for violations of quality standards and had failed drug quality testing on 19 different occasions. When analyzed, samples tested positive for diethylene glycol, also known as DEG, which is a solvent used in antifreeze and brake fluid. This was the fifth major DEG poisoning event in India since 1972, and the last had unfortunately killed 33 children in Gurgaon. The second incident was more recent. 66 children died recently in the Gambia due to adulterated cough syrup manufactured in India by a company called Maiden Pharmaceuticals, which had also been flagged prior. Again, diethylene glycol was the culprit. 5 people also died in September this year after being administered propofol, which is a general anesthetic during surgery. Samples failed on multiple counts when they were analyzed, including the bacterial endotoxin sterility, which means that it contained bacterial endotoxin, which can essentially lead to what we know as septic shock. So Dinesh, could you run us through why such episodes occur and what drove you both to write this book?
Thank you, Dr. Pinto, for moderating the session and to Artha Global for organizing it. I think that, the best way that I can answer the question that you're asking is that these are incidents that, sort of make the front pages of the newspaper, although, it may be only for a few days. The crime here is so, gut-wrenching that children essentially succumb to these kind of situations. And we see them reported until the next news cycle takes over. But the point here is that the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, as a country, do we have systems in place that detect situations of this nature that happen on a routine basis? For example, a lot of us are on maintenance medication, right? You turn 40 or 50, you're put on a hypertension drug, to try and control your blood pressure, and you take it for a long periods of time. Do we have systems in place that actually sort of look at that closely and say, is the drug working as intended? Do we monitor our drug supply? Why is it that a strip of amoxicillin and clavulanic acid is currently sold by 217 companies? I'm just looking at the data here. Under 292 brands, has a price variation between 40 rupees at the lowest level to 336 rupees at the highest level for a 6-pack tab, right? In India, the problem that we have is healthcare is largely out of pocket, and we only think about it when we badly need it. We don't think about these issues when we are hale and healthy, because we've got tons of other problems that we have to deal with. In 2015, after the Ranbaxy case broke, Prashant and I had spent almost a year researching the problems with the drug regulation. We approached the ministry, we approached the government. We then approached the Supreme Court of India as well through 2 public interest litigations, only to be told that this is an academic issue. It isn't worthy of the court's time to try and take a look at it. After exhausting those 2 avenues, the only thing that was left to us at this point in time was to try and then start a conversation in public so that we understand what our drug supply is. I think that even as a physician, Dr. Pinto, in your practice, I'd like to hear, how often do you really think about drug quality as a variable when you diagnose and treat your patients, right? I think that how many of our doctors within our medical practice really pay attention to the fact that there is variability in drug quality. Why is it otherwise that the same drug is sold at 40 rupees versus 336 rupees, right? And so these are systemic issues that we have. And the only way Prashant and I thought that we could start a conversation was to write about it in a way that gave people the tools to at least have this conversation among themselves and ask questions. And that's the only way that we can affect change. So the 3 cases that you've highlighted, right? These are systemic of the dysfunction in our system. Think about it, right? You live in Bombay, Dr. Pinto. A lot of us live in big cities. We have access to good healthcare facilities, right? We have large hospitals. In Bombay, you can go to Lilavati and JJ. In Delhi, you can go to Escorts, Fortis, and in Medanta, wherever, right, you want to go to. But a large part of the population lives in rural India, where we don't have access to good primary care. You know what our primary care is? Somebody falls sick in a village, they don't have access to a primary care because we don't have primary health care centers. That person essentially goes to a medical store and says, can you please give me something that would alleviate the situation that I'm dealing with, a headache, a fever, whatever that they're dealing with. Medicine is our first line of defense for health. It's not access to primary health care. And if we can't fix our medicine supply, then what are we doing, right? So the incidents that you've narrated there are a symptom of the malaise that we have within our drug supply and our drug regulatory framework. And this book is essentially a small tool to start a conversation around this issue. Healthcare is much, much bigger, right? It's huge. Medicines are only a part of it. But in our country, medicines are the first line of defense for public health. So I'll stop there, and then we can talk about it some more later on.
No, I think those are very valid points. And, people often ask us doctors, what do you think based on your experience? And I think One of the things that we realize that our experience is not good enough. It's not statistically significant enough. It's not random enough. As you said, I might be in a city which has access to a different set of variables as compared to somebody who's across the country. Which is why random sampling plays an important role, which is why proactive sentinel surveillance plays a role, rather than wait for an incident and then try and analyze what went wrong. Again, I quote from your book, which says, it's a quote from somebody who says that children often seem to be the sentinels in this cruel and unintended form of toxic surveillance. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think that's a reflection of children being smaller, having a lower body weight, Therefore, a small change in dosages is magnified many-fold in children, and therefore, unfortunately, they manifest as having severe illnesses. Very often, we lose children to these flaws in drug regulation. When the discussion around quality gets initiated after such events, unfortunately, the focus tends to be just on prevention of these extreme events. And of course, we all want that. We all want that these extreme events be prevented. But I think what's equally important is ensuring efficacy, which doesn't very often get spoken of. So if I give you an example, if a person with diabetes, for example, gets admitted to a hospital with severe ketoacidosis, and if the drugs don't really deliver and a person passes away, we very often just assume that this is one of those extreme situations in which the person would have passed away no matter what. It's very difficult for a person at the ground to know whether the quality of the drug really played a role. I'm going to cite two examples, again from your book. One is of a drug called glibenclamide, which was substituted for glipizide by a company called Alfred Berg and Company in Tamil Nadu. So these were two different drugs. One cost 1,900 rupees a kg, the other cost 9,000 rupees a kg. And the company substituted one for the other. So not only were they using an inexpensive product and selling it at a very high price, but also these two drugs completely differed in the way they acted. And therefore, a person with diabetes who was taking one drug and received the other could have severe hypoglycemic episodes, could have complications. The other example you cite is of a company called Old Care Labs in Gujarat, in whom surveillance was done to look at azithromycin. And they found that a 200 milligram tablet actually contained 25 milligrams, which is about 12% of what it should contain. So could you tell us a little more about NSQ drugs, so not standardized or not of a certain quantity, about the XLN database, which is supposed to kind of log in and tell us about all these inspections and what goes wrong, and the harm that substandard drugs can potentially cause. So not just spurious drugs, but drugs which are not of a standard quality.
Yeah. No, those are, I mean, one of the things that we did when we were writing this book was to try and provide as much data as possible, because otherwise what happens, and I've seen this when the Ranbaxy situation broke, right? It is my word against somebody else's word. I may say that we have, poor quality drug supply. The CDSU will make an argument, that's not the case, right? Because they say that, our drug supply is a certain way. The point here is that they're very different in the way that they think about drug supply, right? So here is the thing, right? In order to answer the question you're asking, we have to step back and ask ourselves, what is quality, right? What does quality mean in the context of medicine, right? Simplest answer is quality is fit for use. As a doctor, when you're prescribing medicine, you expect the drug to work the way it's intended to work, right? Because you've read the clinical studies, you've read the journals that say that this is the way the drug gets metabolized, this is the therapeutic action it generates, these are the potential side effects that you can potentially see in the patient population that you look at. That should not be a variable for us. The way that we think about, the way our regulations are written in terms of quality is that we measure quality in the final product, right? The rest of the world thinks about quality as quality by design, right? So the code of good manufacturing practices, what is called GMP, that basically says that when you manufacture a drug, every step has a control built into it so that the final product essentially is of a certain quality. This is how the rest of the world thinks about quality. Our regulations, when we talk about quality, we think about quality in the final product. This is a legacy of the British era regulation that we have, where we say that when we think about quality, we say that the state drug inspectors will go buy a sample of the drug from the market. They'll send it to a state drug lab. The lab is supposed to analyze that, and based on a certain set of standards, is supposed to adjudicate that as standard quality drug or non-standard quality drug, right? So when we talk about not a standard quality, because most of our drug supply is generic, we essentially look at three different things, right? First is there enough active ingredient in it? The Old Care Laboratories examples that you cited, if the label on that say 200 milligrams and you only have 25, obviously as a prescribing physician, who's saying that, okay, to your patient, take 5 days of, or 3 times a day of this particular drug in order to address the infection the patient has, is the patient actually getting that amount of medicine in order to therapeutically help that patient? Clearly not, right? The fact is that medicine is out there. Hundreds of people are actually buying it with the expectation that it actually contains 200 milligrams of azithromycin, right? Likewise, when you have bad actors substituting a cheaper quality API compared to a more expensive drug, knowing fully well that the way that the drug metabolizes differently in diabetics, and you could have fatal consequences with hypoglycemia in that particular case, unless we hold these people to account. How are they going to sort of get this message that this is not acceptable? They should not be able to do this. And what we do in our book is we recount the entire process of how we enforce quality, starting with the way that we measure quality, that we ask our drug inspectors to go buy samples and then send it to the labs. How effective is the lab testing, right? So we talked about, the different parameters, the 3 different parameters, right? One is that, does it contain enough active ingredient? The second is, does it dissolve in your gut properly and become bioavailable? This is why studies become really important. The third is, does it contain any impurity, especially if you're using drugs in critical care situations like injectables, right? You don't want that to be contaminated with bacterial endotoxins or other kinds of contaminants, because you're directly injecting it into people's bloodstream at that point in time, right? So is our straight machinery really capable of detecting all of these things when we talk about medicine quality, right? These are systemic issues that we have to answer. And unfortunately, until this time, we have brushed all these things under the carpet. Even today, if you look at like the propofol case, right, that the people are still talking about today, majority of what is actually analyzed in the labs are essentially, does the drug have enough active ingredient? Despite the fact that the Indian Pharmacopoeia prescribes a drug monograph that says these are all the tests that have to be done, more than half of the labs in the country don't have the equipment, procedures, even reference standards to do all those testing. So what kind of confidence are we talking about in our drug supply? And these are hard questions to answer from a policy point of view, right? Because building infrastructure of a country of our size, the diversity of our size, right? Look at the diversity that exists between Badi in Himachal Pradesh and Kerala, which has a significantly more educated population. How do you think about medicine quality, practice of medicine itself among the physician community, for example? These are questions that we have to ask and answer, right? Because at the end of the day, healthcare is largely out of pocket in the country, right? So at the end of the day, it's money coming out of your pocket, my pocket, somebody else's pocket. And if it's not delivering the value that you expect, we can't just brush this thing under the carpet and say, okay, we won't talk about this anymore, right? So those are the questions that we're hoping that people will learn and ask on City the book.
So again, looking at your book in terms of numbers, I see that between 2007 and December 2020, 7,525 drugs sampled from the markets in just 3 states who report to the NSQ,
right.
to the XLM, were found to be not of a standard quality. And that's a pretty high number. And I also note that you mentioned the fact that the denominator is really not known. So we don't know how many were sampled. They pretty much publish only the ones which don't meet their targets. Recall is a big problem too, right, Dinesh? Because even in the case that happened in Jammu, 8 months after the initial cluster of cases were reported, there was a 2-year-old toddler, Radhika from Badi in Himachal Pradesh, who died possibly as a consequence of the failure to recall the drug from the market. I think that's a pretty important question as well.
I mean, so we actually recount the process of how the bureaucracy systematically undercut the need for a drug recall for 46 years. In the book, in one of the chapters, we actually go through the drugs consultative committee meeting minutes of how every time this issue was raised, right? Even in the propofol case now, we have 5 deaths, right? It's not that particular formulation of propofol made by this company in Badi. It's not as if that drug is only was used in that particular instance. It's available in the market right now. All the CDSUS is doing right now is basically issuing a public notice, because we don't have a law. We don't have the means to actually sort of effect a recall knowing fully well that there's a problem with this particular drug. And what we do in our book is we actually recount the exact process, 46 years, how, despite knowing fully well that this is a problem, that bureaucrats and the industry essentially undercut the need for an effective drug recall law and the consequences of what you're talking about. 11 children died, right? All the CDSCO does is basically say to the state regulators, please do something about it. The similar formulation by the same company exists, and 8 months later, a 2-year-old child dies exactly from the same situation. Now, who's accountable for this?
So I think these are all very, very important questions that we need to ask ourselves. I'll move over to you, Prashant. So imprisoned till the rising of the court was a new term I saw frequently in the book, which tends to be a common punishment for those who don't meet drug standards and are found to be guilty. And that essentially means that they are prisoned till the court is in session. So it's usually typically a few hours or till the end of the day. And fines seem to be typically in the range of about 10,000 to a lakh. And this is a recurring theme in the book. I also see that between 1993 to 2015, the median time to disposal of a case in Maharashtra was about 10.5 years, with an average of 11.35 years based on the e-courts database from Maharashtra. There's also an extreme case that you cite about with regards to an antibiotic, which was ampicillin, which was found to have less than half of the active ingredient. And the pharma company was acquitted after 23 years and 5 months. So I have two questions for you, Prashant. Do you think that these crimes are viewed with a less degree of seriousness because they are thought of as white-collar crimes? What do you think is the right way to deter such crimes in the future? We know worldwide self-regulation is not necessarily going to work. So what do you think is the right way to take this forward?
Thank you, Dr. Pinto. That's a relevant question. In case there are problems with my video, just let me know. I think I have some bandwidth issue today.
Sure.
Yeah, so coming to your question, yes, I mean, it was striking to us that across the states where we could access data, that is Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, it seems to be a pair in the rare case that they do secure convictions. Magistrate passes a sentence, simple imprisonment till the rising of the court, as you said. The courtroom after a few hours, after paying a fine of between is the manner in which are prosecuted. So we have seen a couple of cases where the drug inspector to the judiciousness of question. So, for example, in a case where an antibiotic, which was azithromycin, a 200 mg tablet tested to have only, I'm going to switch off my video because I think I'm having bandwidth issues.
Sure.
Yeah. So, so basically for azithromycin, where the 200 mg tablet tested to have only 23 mg, the drug inspector basically told the judge that, oh, there's no problem. The patient just has to take more of the drug. It's as if there was just less sugar in the tea and you add a little bit more sugar and everything becomes all right. And the judge bought it. And we've seen this happen in a number of cases. So one aspect is definitely that drug inspectors are not prosecuting these cases vigorously. A second problem is, as you said, that, in India tend to be treated much more leniently. And in this case, these are judicial magistrates who are dealing with day in and day out, where they can see a particular offense. But that's not drugs a lot of time, right? The magistrate is looking at a test report where the drug has failed quality testing, but he can't see of him, which is why they tend to go easy on some of these in some of these cases, and not sentence them to jail.
Right. I think there's also this distinction between, the sin of commission versus the sin of omission. So when you see an obvious ill effect of a drug, then you think it's bad. But when you don't have the active ingredient in the quantum that it should be, and that can lead to a lot of complications as well, like antimicrobial resistance, the lack of efficacy, but that's not as visible as the ill effects of a bad drug. Let's talk about the issue of federalism and jurisdiction, which comes up in the book as well, also in the context of the new guidelines which are being formed. We have 38 drug regulators with jurisdictions that do not seem to cross in the country, and it's therefore difficult for prosecutions to occur interstate. So I realize that if you notice, if a drug is found to be not of a standard quantity or quality in the state of Maharashtra, but it's manufactured in a different state, it's difficult for a regulator to go across states and prosecute a person. They have to get the sanction of the state in which the drug was manufactured. The Mashelkar Committee in 2003 recommended centralizing drug licensing. There is also the concern about drug regulation being viewed more as a manufacturing issue and not a public health issue, which is reflected in the drug regulators very often being individuals from the IAS, or there are a couple of states which actually have individuals from the police services and the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, holding post. What are your thoughts on this, Prashant?
Thank you, Dr. Bindo. Yeah, that's a relevant question. So on the issue of federalism, this is a 95-year-old question that has been dogging drug regulation in India. So in 1927, when Sir Jaffer moved the first resolution to the Indian legislature for the creation of
I think we're losing you, Prashant. So let me move over to Dinesh while Prashant gets his network back.
Yeah. So in 2003, there was a proposal to centralize.
Okay, moving over to you, Dinesh. So I'm quoting from the book again. This is a former DCGI, GN Singh, who says, if I follow US standards, I will have to shut down almost all drug facilities in the country. So my question is, are high quality medicines inherently expensive to make? And is the competition to be lower priced and make very tiny margins and make your profits on volumes a real issue? I also allude, this is again in the book, which says that 10% of all government supply was found to be of an inferior quality. This is from a survey from the National Institute of Biologicals. And a quarter of drugs procured by the armed forces was substandard. This is from a CAG study. So do you think this pressure to keep the cost really, really low makes it very challenging to maintain quality standards?
So this is actually a really, really important question, right? Because the talking points, both from the industry and from the regulator, is that, look, if we increase the standards of manufacturing, right, then we will impact accessibility and affordability of our medicine supply. This is the issue that comes up. Now, before I answer this question, let me give you a few facts, right? The first fact is that larger pharma companies, right, that actually export to the US and European market, they actually have separate manufacturing facilities for these export-oriented markets compared to what they make for India. This is given. This is true. Anybody who works in the industry will vouch for that. The facilities that actually sort of make drugs that are exported to the United States and Western Europe are made in a completely different facility compared to what they're made for India. And the reason for that is because our standards within the Schedule M of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, which governs manufacturing, are much, much lower compared to what they are for the export markets. That's the reason why companies actually have two different sets of manufacturing facilities. So this is a fact. The second fact is that the most often touted metric that is quoted of 10% not of standard quality drugs, I've looked at that specific survey, the design of the survey. I think the way the survey has been designed is a severe undercounting. The reality is closer to what the CAG report says of the armed forces procurement. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 drugs in our country are of not standard quality. And there are other studies also to confirm this thing. So this is also a fact. Now, the question that you're asking is that If you, as GN Singh had said, if you raise the standards of manufacturing, is it really true that you're going to impact the pricing of these medicines so that they become unaffordable for people, right? So there are two things I have to say about that. One is that what good is it of spending whatever little money that you have and getting a poor quality medicine that does not give you the therapeutic benefit that you expect it to have? What good is it for the patient? What good is it for the doctor? Because at the end of the day, the patient's going to go back to the doctor and say, whatever you prescribed is really not helping me, right? That's number one. Number two is that this notion about increasing standards impacts quality is actually, the foundation is going to be putting out a report on the Indian Pharmacopoeia Commission in the next week or so. In one of the sections of that report, we actually go through an analysis of why this talking point is actually debunked completely. There isn't really an impact on the pricing of medicine related to quality. It's a talking point that the small and medium, section of an industry has, because the large guys, they do it. They do it for export markets, right? And they know exactly what the export markets are, what they need to comply with the export markets. And they also know that it's not that big of a difference between the export markets and what they need to make for India and also for countries where we export to that don't have strict regulations in terms of drug quality. They know that they can do it, but they don't do it because there's no requirement in the law. This conversation, this talking point essentially comes from the small and medium parts of the industry that has to incur certain amount of cost in order to comply with GMP, and they just don't want to do it, right? So please just wait for a little while. This report is going to be out. You can read it, and we actually go through the analysis to see if you have to comply with the standards of ICH7, of GMP, does it really make a difference? How much of a difference does it make in the pricing of the drug? Remember, pricing is an issue that's completely divorced from quality today. Pricing is controlled by National Pharmaceutical NPPA, right? The authority that comes under the Ministry of Pharmaceuticals and the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. Health quality is regulated by the CDSCO, which comes under the Ministry of Health. Completely two different things. But the thing is, the industry plays against each other because it's in their interest to do that.
Right. So there's another interesting question, and I think transparency is a theme which is recurrent in the book. Make people transparent, make them accountable, let people know what's happening, and quality will automatically improve. So this is a comment from Kiara Reed, who says, if you were producing, say, a cheese, you would want your cheese to always be good and tasty, otherwise people would not buy it. Why the pharma companies don't seem to care that their product is constantly good? Because people don't question it, or because they can get away with it. I think that's an interesting point, that both, regulation needs to be in place so that quality improves, but at the same time, transparency would lead people to asking uncomfortable questions and therefore changing quality by itself. So again, this is on a slightly lighter note. I read from the book again. This was Major Maitra in Punjab testifying in front of the Chopra Committee in 1930-31. He says, one remedy titled Conquest of Death was accompanied by literature which claimed that in case the medicine has reached the patient too late and he has breathed his last, he may be revived if made to inhale this remedy within 3 hours of death by artificial respiration. So 90 years later, some of the advertisements in today's newspapers, especially possibly in the alternative medicine space, still seem a bit problematic. This was also amplified during the pandemic. So what do you think about this?
I couldn't say it any better. I mean, if you look at the advertisements that we see from the alternative medicines industry today, they're no different than what the Chopra Committee report had testimony to, right? I mean, some of these things are like really, really out there, and it doesn't seem like we have learned any lessons. But just going back to the comment from Kiara, right? Listen, if you have bad cheese that have gone bad, the moment you put it in your mouth, you'll know, right? I mean, there's a difference between cheddar and blue cheese. And if you like gorgonzola, you know exactly what it tastes like compared to if you're using the standard American cheese. The trouble with medicine is that I, as a patient, I don't know whether my medicine is bad quality or not, right? I have to rely on the judgment of my doctor. And that information asymmetry is what the industry is exploiting today. Dr. Pinto's patients who he prescribes medicine, right? I'm assuming many of them, and correct me, Dr. Pinto, if I'm not correct. I don't know how many of them really come from the pharmaceutical industry, are able to understand what the medicine is supposed to do and what the side effects are supposed to be, right? So that when they take the medicine, they can judge for themselves whether this medicine is of a good quality or not. More often than not, I would presume that they actually come back to you and say, Dr. Pinto, I don't feel well, even after taking this medicine, right? So the difference, Kiara, in the question that you're asking is, as a consumer, you're empowered to know if the product, in which, in your case, the cheese, or a telephone, the cell phone that you bought, or a television that you bought, if it doesn't function the way it is functioning, you actually have the ability to find that out. When it comes to medicine, you do not. There is a huge information asymmetry here, right? You have to go back to your physician. You have to go back to your surgeon and explain to them. And sadly, in our country, most physicians and surgeons, and Dr. Pinto, you may disagree with me, but I think that my experience is that evidence-based medicine is something that we have a long way to go, even among the medical community, to understand what clinical evidence really means. If we didn't do this, right, we wouldn't be prescribing ivermectin that we saw with during COVID. If we understood what evidence-based medicine actually meant, we wouldn't be writing out scripts of favipiravir, which the national committee that actually had the COVID protocol, they did not put it on their list of recommended medicine, despite the fact that the CDSCO approved it, right? The fact is that how 762 crores worth of favipiravir was sold in 2019 and 2020. What was the clinical evidence for that? So, we have bigger problems here, right? We need to educate our medical community around, of what clinical evidence really means.
Yeah, so I think that's a very valid point, that one of the reasons medicine can't be treated as an open market or a free market, so to speak, is precisely because of this knowledge asymmetry. So there's a lot of trust and there's a lot of faith in the relationship between a doctor and a patient, or a regulator and the public, which is why I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with the job. I see Prashant is back. Prashant, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I hope this connection's better.
Yeah, it does sound better. So Prashant, something that Dinesh has already alluded to, COVID saw a lot of new drugs having accelerated approvals with data that was very often 30 patients, it was 150 patients. What do you think are the lessons that we've learned from COVID, and how should we regulate this in the future or ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, I mean, during COVID, one of the problems was we really didn't understand how exactly what standard the regulator was using to approve new drugs. For example, they were using terms like emergency use authorization, clinical trial mode, where none of these terms were actually there in the law. So we filed an RTI with the Ministry of Health, asking them under which provision are you granting these approvals, and they were not able to identify the exact provision. So the behavior during the pandemic was completely arbitrary on part of the DCGI, and even the pharma industry did not know under what provisions they were getting approvals. There's an amusing anecdote that we mention in the book, where Biocon thought it got approval under one particular provision, and then it turned out that the Ministry of Health said that no, we didn't grant them permission under that particular section of the law. So there was complete chaos, because the Drug Controller General seems to look at the the Drugs and Cosmetics Act as merely not a mandatory provision of law, but something that they can consult whenever they require. So the only way to reform this is we need to, first of all, have a lot more transparency, because we don't know a lot of times. During this entire process, the only official government information that all of us saw about drug approvals were the minutes of the SEC meetings, the subject expert committee. We didn't see anything else. So unlike the US FDA or the European Medical Agency, where they put out so much information. So that's why throughout the book, we keep saying more transparency, more transparency, more transparency. The moment we have access to information, we'll be able to hold the drug regulator more accountable.
I think that's a great point. Aniruddha Datta in the comment says, I'm told that Cipla is the only Indian company which manufactures drug for the Indian and the export markets in the same facilities, from what I have heard. Kiara again makes the same point, in a sense, asking whether drugs that are destined for export to advanced countries or to first world countries, so to speak, are of a higher and better quality. So my question, Prashant, is there a way to kind of enforce that if you are exporting, then you better be producing the same quality drugs for your local market as well? Do you think that's something that's possible, and and therefore that becomes a quality benchmark?
Well, that's going to be a bit difficult. So for exports, there's clearly a segregation in the Indian pharma industry where not even all exports are of high quality. So companies exporting to Europe and the United States are subject to inspections by American and European drug inspectors. So they are automatically held to a higher standard. But we know, and there is some scholarship on this, where when the drugs that are exported to Africa and other emerging economies or low-income economies, there is a complete difference in quality, and the quality is far worse than what is sold even in India. So the industry is clearly discriminating between markets based on the standards of regulation that they expect. Now, trying to fix this legally is very difficult. I mean, the only way to fix this is if the drug inspectors in India step up and actually do proper inspections. You can't change this with a diktat of the law.
So Dinesh, Shashi Verma asks a question, is there a scope for a bit of regulatory competition, a sort of kite marking that would allow regulators in one state to demonstrate that they are tougher and therefore drugs certified from them are safer? I think that's a great question. So made in so-and-so state being like a brand, like an assurance of quality.
Right. So remember, it's a great question, and it's an idea that we should certainly explore. But in order to answer that question, you have to acknowledge two realities. India is one market, right? Where does majority of our manufacturing actually happen today, drug manufacturing? It happens in Badi in Himachal Pradesh, because the government has essentially enabled through tax-free zones these manufacturing facilities to be set up. But the fact remains is the drug manufactured in Badi will make it to Kerala within a period of a week or 2 weeks. And there is nothing in the law that will empower the regulator in Tamil Nadu who finds that the drug made in Badi is not of a standard quality to hold that company to account. They cannot, for example, take punitive actions like raids and seizures. It's not in the law. They don't have jurisdiction in Himachal Pradesh, right? They cannot ban that. I mean, they can potentially ban that particular drug within Tamil Nadu. But remember, these companies essentially make a portfolio of medicines, right? If you find one medicine that is of not a standard quality, what confidence do you have that they're not doing that for the second drug that they're making, right? The third thing is public procurement today, right? The Tamil Nadu State Medical Corporation that actually procures medicines for distribution, the district hospitals and public facilities in Tamil Nadu actually does a reasonably good job. They're the ones who actually found out in the case of Alfred Berg that this company was substituting a lower quality, lower price active ingredient, for glipizide, that for the diabetic medicines. But because that company happened to be local, at least they had the ability to take them to court. Imagine if that company was based in Himachal. They would have no ability to do anything to them other than sending a letter to them saying, do something about this. This is what the CDSCO does. We find a problem with propofol with 5 deaths. What does the CDSCO do? They write a letter to the state drug controller saying, can you please look into this? Because the law doesn't have teeth to enforce this. The question is very valid. Can quality become a differentiator among states, right? So that you can say that in our state, the quality of medicine is higher. That can happen if the law and the regulation provides a framework to do that, right? Today, we don't have that.
Prashant, you have
If
a
I
point?
can just chip in with my 2 cents, for all practical purposes, right now, there is a competition between different states on regulation, except it's converted into a race to the bottom. Because the moment you strengthen your regulations in one particular state, and it becomes tougher for you to manufacture, but you have to compete with that fellow in Badi, chances are you're going to shut shop, move to Badi, because that's going to be easier for you.
Right.
So
Right.
so you can't have a common market and then hope that states compete with each other to produce better quality medicine. It
And
works in the reverse. They
I
all
think-
are in a competition. This is a race to the bottom, and nothing's going to. And we are only as good as the worst regulated state. So unless Himachal Pradesh improves its quality, the quality in the rest of India is not going to improve, because you can't survive in the market competing with cutthroats who are not, doing basic quality checks. The only way to survive is to cut your own quality checks.
Yeah, I think this is the point that comes up again and again in the book as well, that the ease of doing business cannot take precedence over safety and standards. And unfortunately, sometimes in this this kind of aspiration to keep it industry friendly and to keep it business friendly, does not necessarily serve the best interests of your consumers.
Right.
So we have a question from Saurabh Modi for Prashant. Should we be concerned about the standards for Ayurvedic medicines? I'm guessing they may be tough to test for efficacy, but they seem to be a big culprit on health and are quite mainstream. Or should the focus stay on allopathic medicines?
Yeah, so one of the big problems with Ayurvedic medicines in India are we don't have any standards. So the entire model of regulation for the modern pharmaceutical industry is essentially standardization. The moment you have standardization, you have the concept of a standard quality, which you can measure everybody against. In Ayurveda, we just don't have that, because the moment you try to standardize Ayurveda, you have to get into the science of how these drugs are working. And therein are going to lie some very uncomfortable answers, which our Indian body politic does not want to confront. Because Ayurveda is deeply tied into the narrative of, the glorious Hindu civilization. And nobody in their right mind wants to question that. So standardization, ideally, if you do that, a lot of this stuff will get sorted out. A second problem, if I can add, is with the Ayurvedic industry now. Since 1982, there has been a concept of patent and proprietary Ayurvedic medicine. So these are not basically the old formulations that were, there in the traditional Ayurvedic text. Rather, these are new combinations of drugs that the Ayurvedic industry has been allowed to create. And nobody really knows what is the basis of allowing these new drugs into the market without any kind of, testing or, clinical trials. And therein lies the problem. Within the Ministry of, Department of Ayush first, then the Ministry of Ayush, there's so much confusion on whether they actually want to conduct clinical trials. We recount that in more detail in our book, but there is a complete reluctance between, amongst Ayurvedic practitioners and the industry to embrace modern science and modern clinical trials. Because for a part, there are several Ayurvedic practitioners who will tell you that Ayurveda is not just about, rational science. There is something extra, suprasensory in it. So we're not even in the realm of rationality over here. We are a step behind, where we are looking at medicine through the lens of, these magical religious claims, wherein, it's almost equivalent to trying to pray to the gods to get better.
Right, and I think-
and just like,
Sure.
So just to kind of round off what Prashant said, I think the point here is that just go back and look at how much money we've spent with the Ministry of Ayush. We've documented this. 17 1,000 crores in the last decade. Do you think that money could have been spent elsewhere more effectively in public health? I mean, this is a question, if we ask, then we'll be called an anti-national today. This is the reality of our medicine. So,
right. And again, I think you raised the point in the book as well that, all herbal medicines are not necessarily bad. You give the example of artemisinin, but the standardization and the effort that it took to prove that artemisinin works is something that we really need to do as part of the scientific tempo. There is a comment from Murli Neelkantan who says the profit margins of pharma companies are sufficiently high to invest in quality. If a few of them go out of business, that's actually good for patients. I think that's an interesting comment. So there's a question from Shashi Verma. Do you have a sense of how much increased healthcare costs does the country incur as a result of poor pharmaceuticals? Is that potentially a lot higher than the cost of any improvements that need to be made to pharmaceuticals?
I mean, measuring that is really difficult. But I mean that I'm sure there are costs in the sense that, if people aren't recovering well enough with medicines, there will be associated costs with that. But I don't think anybody has sat down and actually tried to quantify. Just measuring the percentage of NSQ drugs in the market itself is a challenge.
Right. So Dr. Dr. Pinto, I have just one piece of data that may be interesting, right? So in a country like the United States with privatized healthcare, if you look at the overall spend on medicine, it's about between 8 and 11%, whichever year that you actually look at. Because some years, you have a lot more generics versus patented drugs versus certain years. So if you're on average, as a percentage of the GDP, if you look at the healthcare spend, between 8 and 11% is what the country spends on medicine. If you look at similar analysis in India, the money that we spend on medicine is about 1/3. It's between 28 and 33%, right? Now, the question here is that why do we spend as much money on medicines compared to why a country like US does? I don't know the answer to that. As Prashant said, there's no study that actually tells you this is what it is. More and even more important is that what is the actual real cost of poor quality medicine? I don't think that there is anything that I've seen that tells me that this is how it translates to.
So this is a question for Dinesh. So there are researchers and scientists in the room. What do you think would be the top 3 research priorities to highlight the issues of drug regulation to policymakers and to the public?
This is a really interesting question. So, Prashant and I were talking about this earlier. Just look at, what happened with the approval process for covaxin, right? So Prashant mentioned that the only rationale publicly available for approval of this particularly indigenously made vaccine, how it was bungled up. And look at the response to that in terms of vaccine hesitancy in public, right? I can argue that development of covaxin was innovation, right? It was something new that was done. We took a whole virion vaccine, expressed it, purified the protein, figured out exactly how to attenuate it and make a vaccine out of it. Innovation, science, right? What did the regulation do? Because it was bungled up, it created vaccine, hesitancy within our people, right? Is that what we want? Just look at China, right? China has invested significantly over the last 2 decades in developing, basic science like drug discovery and development. But there's reporting that Western regulators don't trust clinical data coming from China. If you don't have the confidence in the regulator, what good is your science and innovation? Right? You want to invest in actually developing cutting-edge drugs, biologics, protein-based therapeutics, more power to you. The question is, who's going to trust what you're developing?
Right. So in terms of the research priority, what would be the way to kind of lobby harder? You think we have enough proof already and we don't need a lot more? Or do you think, there are ways in which we can study this further and kind of bring it to the attention of more people? Do you think, for example, the public needs to be sensitized a lot more about these issues?
It does, and the book is an attempt that Prashant and I have made to try and do this. But like, for example, if you ask me a specific question, right? We have something called the Clinical Trial Registry of India, right? We have this the institution that actually ICMR supports this, right? Look how poorly managed it is. Invest in those institutions. Make transparency the centerpiece of trying to do the right thing. That will enable innovation, right? Don't enable people like Baba Ramdev to claim that we have done a clinical trial on coronal and the WHO has certified it somehow, and it becomes like a therapeutic that Patanjali Ayurveda wants to sell in order to make you better for non-serious cases of COVID-19. Don't enable let people use your institutions to abuse science. Invest in institutions, build strong institutions, make sure that you have transparency in the way that the CDSCO reviews the subject expert committee recommendations. Make it publicly available so that it inspires confidence. That is what I would do. If I had the ability to actually build scientific community in the country, research priorities, I would build institutions. I would put my money on building institutions. That's what I would do.
Prashant, so the new drugs, medical devices and cosmetics bill, it's been 82 years since such a big legislation has been tabled. What are the couple of issues that you think would you like prioritized or addressed by the bill, which may not already be there in the draft, or, what do you think should be our top couple of priorities for the bill?
Well, I mean, to begin with, it shouldn't be a copy of the old law, which is what has happened in this case. I usually, when the government sets up drafting committees for legislation, they tend to get outsiders to do it because, it brings in a new perspective. This health minister surprisingly set up a drafting committee, which was headed by the incumbent Drug Controller General of India and other bureaucrats from the existing system, who are very, very comfortable with the status quo. And hence the final bill that we have seen is basically a replica of the old law mostly. So that is the first tragedy. The second problem is, and Dinesh and me have written an op-ed in this in the Indian Express, is this dangerous new trend wherein the industry lobbied for decriminalizing offenses under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So the Modi government has been right now, has been pushing for decriminalizing a lot of economic offenses. That may make sense in the context of, say, check bouncing or, under the Companies Act, you miss a regulatory filing, you shouldn't have to go to jail for that. But when it comes to drugs, where a person can be harmed by a quality defect, it is a moral imperative that the manufacturer face some consequences beyond just paying a monetary fine. So there is a provision in this new bill which basically lists out 43 defects for which it will become a compoundable offense. That is, you pay a fine and you can get out of the criminal proceedings. So, I mean, far from making the situation better, this new law is actually a step backwards. And we would basically recommend that the government not go ahead with it and instead institute a new reform process with three key tenets as the pillars of the entire process. One is transparency by design, like write the legislation in such a way that the regulator is forced to be transparent. Second is this federalism issue, wherein we need to, resolve this deadlock that has been there over the last 95 years and have a more centralized system of at least licensing. If you still want to have a federal system for enforcement, maybe that's okay. And a third issue is we need to change this entire administrative setup of the CDSCO, which is the national regulator. Right now, the CDSCO is a department under the DGHS, which is the Directorate General of Health Services. The DGHS itself is a department of the Ministry of Health. So the DGHS is headed by a joint secretary level officer. The DCGI is basically less than a joint secretary level officer in that case. Now, what we ask for in the book is to spin it off as one of these new modern regulators we've seen for, TRI or SEBI, as in a new and independent corporate structure, so that you can cut down a red tape on a lot of these issues. And lastly, the regulator has to be staffed with an entire new set of people. Because right now, the Indian drug regulator is stuffed with people with degrees in pharmacy. That's your basic requirement to become a drug inspector and climb up the bureaucratic chain. And that may have made sense in the 40s. We looked at drug regulation as a manufacturing issue. But today, drug regulation is looked at as a public health issue. We need professionals with experience in public health, people able to contemplate the consequences of drug approvals, etc., etc. Ideally, a medical doctor with a public health background.
So it's 8 o'clock. We'll do a couple of last questions. So I think this is kind of a philosophical question from Shrikant Mangalam, who says, how much of the current state of drug regulation is a reflection of the value for life in India? How is the state any different from the environmental regulations, for example? Dinesh, you want to take that?
I don't know what to say. I think that, we see the same pattern, when it comes to value of life, time and time again, right? My gut reaction is drug enforcement, drug regulation is no different than environmental regulation. We see this time and time again. Unfortunately, I think that this is pervasive within our society, and all we can do is try and raise this and keep raising it as an issue with the hope that people pay attention to it and try and address it, in time.
So this is a question from Kalyani Rajan, which says, to add to what Lance just said, what do you think the public can do to give the issue more importance or to profile it?
Prashant, you want to take that?
In fact, I have a question for both of you, which is, possibly the last question for the evening, which is how, the change is going to take time, and hopefully there will be change with all the pushback that we are trying to mobilize. But while we wait for that change, how can we empower end users? So doctors and patients who are essentially the end users here on a day-to-day basis. So what are the best indicators, given the limited data we have, that a drug I prescribe, for example, is high quality? Do you also see some sort of a crowd-based system to improve accountability, like COVID19.org, India.org, which was during COVID? Can we have some sort of a feedback mechanism from the end users to complain about quality and create some sort of a database whenever they feel that a particular drug didn't work? Maybe kind of flag it in some way. Do you think there is a role for citizen groups to play a role in this? And the other question, that on a day-to-day basis, if you had to advise a doctor or a patient that if you're prescribing a particular molecule, what are the indicators that would keep you sort of safe, or what would be the best bet that you're prescribing quality drugs? What would be your indicators or pointers?
Prashant, why don't you go on first?
Yeah, let me take the first one. I think, citizens groups, it's a bit difficult for them to do much, but I think doctors can be critical players in this battle for reform. So, for example, there is a pharmacovigilance program, on paper at least, with the DCGI, where doctors can report adverse events, related to drugs. The system is very unwieldy. You have to download a form, print it out, fill it in with pen, and file it. But if the IMA or doctors groups can lobby government to make that ADR process a lot more user friendly, and every time you note a patient coming back and complaining about a drug, or you yourself notice adverse events after administering a particular drug, you need to participate in the process and inform the government that there is a problem with this particular drug. And secondly, at least amongst the specialists and the super specialists, I don't know if they're WhatsApp groups, I'm presuming they are, but to actively share information with each other, to let your colleagues know that I prescribed this particular brand and it did not work. So doctors, I think, are going to play the most important role when it comes to changing drug regulation. And we are saying this with experience from history. When the Drugs Act 1940 was enacted, it was a long battle. It was 13 years between, Sir Jaffer moving that resolution and the government of India enacting the law. And the people driving the entire battle were doctors. So common people, I'm afraid, just don't have the required information to be able to contribute to this, apart from perhaps, writing to the government and asking them to do things a little bit better.
Yeah.
So Dinesh, this is a technical. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I mean, just to kind of round off the question that Prashant answered, right? From a patient point of view, from a doctor point of view, I think awareness is really, really important. I mean, I don't know how many doctors are fully aware of the fact that your drug quality can be variable. I think that knowledge and that information is really, really important so that they can then do something about it, right? They can report it, they can write something and talk about it among your WhatsApp groups. The only other point that I want to make, Dr. Pinto, is as follows, okay? There are certain classes of drugs that are what are called narrow therapeutic index drugs, right? So anything to do with women's health, estrogen-related drugs, anything to do with mental health, anything to do with hospitalization settings. The effect of poor quality among these drugs is very, very high. Like, for example, if you're taking, if you've been prescribed an antibiotic, right? Let's assume that the antibiotic pill only has 80% of what is labeled in the amount. You will have problems, and most doctors that I know, what they do is rather than prescribing a 5-day dose, they will do a 7-day dose to compensate for the fact that you're not getting enough antibiotic, because they know from their practice that this is what has happened. So rather than writing a 5-day dose, they'll write a 7-day dose for it. Things of those natures, you can compensate in the clinic. The point here I'm trying to make here is that if, for example, if you're taking medicine for your thyroid problem, levothyroxine, if you're taking Wellbutrin for depression and mood disorders, if you are working in a hospital setting and actually taking propofol, you've been given propofol, or we've seen this with even remdesivir in Bihar. Remember what happened with remdesivir injection? People died because of endotoxin contamination. Widely reported the story in the Mint. These classes of drugs, you really have to be very careful. Both patients, if you are on a thyroid medication, please check. Small changes in dosage manifest very large effects in other therapeutic dosage drugs. So that's the only point that I wanted to say is just be aware of these things. Regular medicine, if you see changes in dosage, doctors normally compensate for that. They know exactly how these drugs effect manifest in people. Maintenance medication, most doctors I know, cardiologists I know, they know exactly how to compensate for lower quality, lower API within the formulation. You cannot do that with nanotherapeutic dosage drugs. You are we've been seeing Lalu Prasad Yadav just got a kidney transplant. You don't want to be on a drug that is for organ transplant rejection that has variation in quality of medicine. It has dire consequences for your body rejecting organs of that nature. So all I'm saying to you is that for these class of drugs that are called narrow therapeutic dosage drugs, please pay attention.
But again, I'm sorry, I'm going to be pushing the question further, but when you say please pay attention and when you say be careful and watch out, what exactly do you mean? So is it more likely that a bigger pharmaceutical company is going to produce something of a higher standard than a smaller pharmaceutical company, or I mean, so how does the end user or the doctor really know? I mean, we know that it's a narrow therapeutic index drug, but how does that actually translate?
So here's the point that I'm going to make, right? So there is no guarantee that a larger brand, a larger company, a larger label will actually produce a higher quality drug, because there's no incentive for us to be able to do that. So let's just get that out of the way. My only plea is that if a patient comes to you complaining about the fact that the drug isn't working, the patient's not feeling well, right? Rather than normally, other than what you would normally do is switch the prescription, right? What you would do is write another prescription for another manufacturer or potentially another class in the same class of drugs, right? If somebody is on a simvastatin, they come back and tell you that simvastatin is not helping me, you probably write a prescription for atorvastatin, but you don't report that. All I'm saying is that as healthcare providers, as nurses, as doctors, if you see this in narrow therapeutic dosage drugs, with levothyroxine, for example, report it, because it becomes really important. Otherwise, what happens is the CDSCO comes back and says, you know what, the data we have says only 3% of our drug supply is substandard. What are you talking about? No one's reporting anything bad about our drug supply. This is all I mean.
I think those are great points, and I think this has been a really great discussion. Thank you, Dinesh and Prashant, for raising a lot of important issues today, and this clearly affects all of us, and it definitely needs a lot more attention than it currently is getting. Protecting the lives of humans is something that binds us all together, so it really shouldn't be a polarizing kind of a debate. We are all on the same side because we all want lives to be saved. I do hope your book and discussions lead to a healthy and constructive engagement among all stakeholders. I would also like to thank all those who attended and participated in this session today. The recording will be available on the Artha Global website. Have a good evening. Thank you.